I need to tell you, as we start, because of the nature of what we're talking about, that I know almost nothing about law. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not giving you legal advice. I'm not giving you any kind of legal counsel. If you rely on what I'm telling you now and end up in jail, I can't do anything for you. I am not responsible for the actions of anybody but myself. And if you do something because of what you heard me say today without checking it with competent legal authority, you deserve whatever happens.
Do you have notes on this?
I do have.
Okay, so I can just concentrate on.
You can listen and I'll give you notes. My notes on this are probably as extensive as they were on the question of the King James authority of the King James Bible. So I think you really should listen rather than try to take notes. Over the past decade and a half, in all parts of our country, churches have found themselves increasingly in conflict with local, state, and federal statutes and regulations. These conflicts have been exacerbated and extenuated both by the aggressiveness and the animosity of officials and by the overzealousness and contrariness of church leaders. Even without trying, many pastors have found themselves in conflict with officials. Even the nightmare of incarceration and heavy fines have been the consequence in some cases. One of the mechanisms which government at all levels uses to bring about compliance on the part of the church is incorporation. That which we initially thought to be a method of facilitating the purchase of property, of protecting the officers from individual legal liability, and creating a visible entity before the law, has become the very means of entanglement. I've been saying to my people in our church that I think we've passed into what really could be called the post-Christian era in America. Because what I said to you a while ago about being a club and being elitists is very true. We're a very inward-looking societal group. We view ourselves in comparison with each other, which the Bible tells us we shouldn't do, but we do anyway. And we compare ourselves with each other, not with anything outside of our ranks. And we have a great capacity for dismissing as irrelevant anything that happens outside the confines of Baptist theological borders. We speak Baptist, and when we go downtown to talk to the banker, he talks banker, and he doesn't understand Baptist. And so we go to the state capitol and try to wear our preacher's clothing and behave as preachers because that's all we know how to do, and they really don't know what to think of us. And we're a foreigner to them just as they are to us. And this whole subject is so broad that we never could probably cover it, but we live really in a foreign society and in an alien society, and that which our immediate forebears, one ecclesiastical generation in front of us, held and understood, is no longer true or viable today. As an example, the pastors I first worked with didn't have Christian schools in their ministries, and they saw no reason for them. Their own children had come through the public schools and were now grown, and they didn't comprehend the vast changes and the comprehensive changes that occurred in the public school movement. So when we started our Christian schools, a lot of the generation just in front of us, age-wise, those who are just our seniors, didn't understand why we were having Christian schools. And, now we are almost, after 15 or 17 years, we're becoming the senior generation. And the next group of preachers coming along under us has still another scope of difficulties to cope with, a whole new set of positions out there in the world. Last year, the U.S. Supreme Court took a very obscure matter in Washington State having to do with two Paiute Indians who smoked peyote as a part of their religious exercise. These were drug counselors at a rehabilitation center. All week long they acted for the state of Oregon as drug counselors. On the weekend they went to their religious services as Indians and smoked peyote. They were fired from their jobs for smoking drugs on the weekend. The state said your position as a drug counselor is inconsistent with what you do in your religion. Therefore, your religious beliefs are violative of your role here, so we're terminating you. They appealed it and lost at the state level. It was appealed to the federal level. It ended up in the U.S. Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court held for the state and upheld their firing. But they did an interesting thing. They said that the long-standing rule which government the test which government had to pass in order to set aside religious beliefs was one of the tests was compelling state interest. In other words, the reason to set aside these persons' faith had to be so compelling that it overrode the right of the individual to practice that belief, even though they might have a right to hold the belief. And in this case, that test had always been in place. The U.S. Supreme Court last year said, we don't think that the compelling state interest test is any longer viable. A state does not have to have compelling state interests, which they couldn't prove in that case, that there was a compelling state interest to set aside this protected religious belief. So the Supreme Court said, we don't believe that the compelling state interest is any longer an appropriate test in all cases, and in some it may be set aside, so that the faith can be overturned even without a compelling state interest. That creates ominous undertones for the future. So all of this bears somewhat of what I'm going to say to you. Now let's begin to confine our thinking just to the mechanism of incorporation. Let me define for you why we would ever have a corporation. Incorporation is a mechanism whereby an entity makes application to the state for recognition as a body or as a company, put that in quotes, which has, for the purposes of law, personhood. In other words, here is something which really it's an organization, but in order for it to have certain benefits, it needs to be looked at by the state as a person, as a continuing person for a lot of different reasons. So you set up a corporation. The word corporation comes from the word corpus or body, and it means an entity which is now given a life of its own, recognized by the state, and that life is in perpetuity, such that it lasts longer than the individual members who make up the corporation. It lasts longer than the pastor, longer than the members, longer than the owner of the company, for that matter, if it's a corporation. There are four, and these are my definitions based on reading, not necessarily legal definitions. There are four aspects to the benefits which accrue from being an incorporation. It has four aspects to its nature. First of all, it has limited liability. In other words, neither the individual members nor its officers can be held legally accountable for the actions of the corporation or for the contracts or for the liabilities of that corporation. In other words, Brother South is a president of a corporation, and the corporation defaults on a loan. He cannot be made personally liable for that loan unless he has volitionally and voluntarily obligated himself separate from the corporate rules and regulations. Now, this limited liability never protected an individual from criminal law, from criminal approach. In other words, you set up a church, and one of the tenets of your church is human sacrifice, and you sacrifice somebody on the altar. You've now done a crime, and the officers would certainly be liable in that kind of a case because you violated criminal law. Okay. Now, in 1979, the state of California passed the Petrus Bill. At the time, it was Senate Bill 1492, I think, or 1498. And that law said that the Attorney General of the state of California, in order to take a church to court, had to have criminal charges to bring to bear. They could not take the church to court under civil law. Which was an amazing thing to have happen, frankly, because prior to that, they were just after churches. In fact, the immediate year prior to that, they had, I think, over 200 churches in court, Worldwide Church of God, among others, and they were really wreaking havoc, and so that law stopped that and really helped things out. So limited liability was one of the definitions. A corporation secondly, has standing before the courts. That is, it can be sued or it can sue. Thirdly, a corporation has ownership rights. It can buy, hold, transfer, sell, or otherwise dispose of real property. Certain rules have been imposed on not-for-profit corporations as to the sale or disposal of its assets. The states have set up rules such that you can't create a corporation, call it non-profit, buy property, and then dispose of that property by giving it to the pastor. Because the rules say that the officers cannot, no value can inure to him. He cannot receive the value from the sale of the property. The fourth characteristic of a corporation is that it has what I've already described, perpetual existence. It goes on without end, in other words. Now, second point in this presentation is that I now want to talk to you about the relationship that incorporation establishes. Now, I think it was Brother Roy Thompson in Cleveland, Ohio, that first put this thought in my mind. But it's been a very strong guiding principle of my attitudes toward government, and that is this. It is not the detail of a particular law or regulation which frightens me, though it might be very onerous. It is rather the relationship that law establishes that frightens me. I'll give you an example. Because in this country we now, much of what we do is based on case law rather than on statutory law. U.S. versus Bob Jones University. University was taken to court because they had a theological belief against interracial dating. They would not allow the students on the campus to date interracially. The thing went to the U.S. Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court said, in effect, there's absolutely no question that these are genuinely and sincerely held religious beliefs, but they violate the public policy of the United States. Therefore, you cannot have tax exemption if what you do violates the public policy of the United States. Now, you might say that's a terrible rule for a school to have. It's a bigoted, rotten rule. You might say that. I don't even care to discuss the rule at the school right now. Whether you agree with it or not is frankly immaterial. It is a genuinely held religious belief. Now, the relationship that exists between the defining powers of government, in this case the IRS and the Justice Department and the Bob Jones University, is that they now have interjected a relationship there which is troubling to the school. The relationship is the problem more than the law itself. If you want to I'll give you another example. Way back in about 1850, the Mormon Church was taken to court over their polygamy doctrine. That, in a big landmark case, which was hailed by Christians all over, the United States Supreme Court said you cannot have more than one wife. Why? Because it violates the Bible. All the Christians said, praise the Lord, good rule. And you're free to practice, or you're free to believe anything you want, but you're not free to practice anything you want, they said. And so with that beginning, there were limitations placed on religious liberty, and there was the relationship is the problem, not the law. Let's say that in Tulare County, they pass a law that no church can hold services that last more than 5 hours at a time, and they cannot have church services going on after 11:30 at night. Say, no problem for me. We never in church more than 5 hours, and we never are there after 11:30 at night. Well, so the law immediately would have no primary effect on you, but it would create a relationship between church and state that I couldn't tolerate. That they should be able to say and define that. So, when we come to the matter of incorporation, we have to talk about relationships that are established by becoming incorporated. Now, in this matter, a gentleman by the name of R.J. Rushdoony, some of you may know that name. He is a Reformed theologian, scholar of some eminence, really, lives in the mountains at Vallecito, California. And I think he is I know he's a strong Calvinist. He's a Presbyterian, essentially. But he believes, doesn't believe in the millennium. He's an amillennialist. So some of his theology and his feeling about government grows out of his feelings about when the millennium starts and what we have to do with that and whether we can help get that started or not. But in 1970, and I believe his position has changed since then, but what he said in 1970 is that the incorporation of a church or Christian agency of any kind was simply a legal formality notifying the state of the existence of such a body and its immunity from statist controls. In recent years, the statists have turned that notification into a form of licensure and control. The matter can be compared with filing a birth certificate. When the birth of Sarah Jones is recorded by her parents and doctor, permission for Sarah Jones to exist is definitely not requested. Rather, a fact is legally recorded. Similarly, in American law, religious trusts, foundations or trusts, did not apply to exist, but recorded their certificate of birth, their incorporation. The current Internal Revenue Service doctrine is that the filing is a petition for the right to exist. This turns the historic position and the First Amendment upside down. It asserts for the federal government the right to establish religion and to control the exercise thereof. As a result, a major conflict of church and state is underway. Now, please understand that many, many lawyers wouldn't agree with Mr. Rushdoony's statement. They would say that, well, that doesn't necessarily mean that we've established religion or that we can limit the exercise of it. But Mr. Rushdoony, I believe, was quite correct in recognizing these assertions that were made by government agencies such as the IRS. Once a church is applied to the state for the benefits outlined above, the bureaucrats assert their legal control over you and to claim the right to enforce certain obligations on corporations and to tax them, unless the bureaucrats decide to exempt the corporation from taxation. Now, a thought chased its way through my mind just then, and it's gone now, but I want to refer to a U.S. Supreme Court case, had nothing to do with the church at all, in 1905. It's a case called Hale versus Hinkle, and it's a railroad case. But in the finding of the U.S. Supreme Court, there are some very important statements about the nature of a corporation. While an individual may lawfully, this is the statement of the case now by, in the summary that was issued by the U.S. Supreme Court. This is the statement of the case as it came before the court. While an individual may lawfully refuse to answer incriminating questions unless protected by an immunity statute, a corporation is a creature of the state. And there is a reserved right in the legislature to investigate its contracts and find out whether it has exceeded its powers. Being a creature of the state, the corporation has not the constitutional right to refuse to submit its books and papers for an examination at the suit of the state. And an officer of a corporation which is charged with criminal violation of a statute cannot plead the criminality of the corporation as a refusal to produce its books. I don't want to read this whole paragraph. While Congress may not have general visitatorial power over state corporations, Congress's powers in vindication of its own laws are the same as if the corporation had been created by an act of Congress. Then in the body of the finding, there's this statement. Upon the other hand, the corporation is a creature of the state. It is presumed to be incorporated for the benefit of the public. It receives special privileges and franchises and holds them subject to the laws of the state and the limitations of its charter. Its powers are limited by law. It can make no contract not authorized by its charter. Its rights to act as a corporation are only preserved to it so long as it obeys the laws of its creation. In our struggle with the State Franchise Tax Board in the early 1980s, the regulatory agency said that if we didn't file certain forms in a timely fashion, they could revoke our corporate status. Time went by, the corporate status, we got a notification of our church because we hadn't complied that our church's status as a corporation had been set aside and revoked. I wrote to them and said, I understand that this happened because we didn't file forms in a timely fashion. But since the corporation is a church, to what extent is the church prohibited from exercising its duties or carrying out its business? And the first letter I got back said, you cannot hold religious services nor conduct your regular church business. So we closed the doors the next day, you understand. But then that was early on. And then when the case went to court and the lawyers for the state began to look at carefully what the bureaucrats had written and said, I got a letter saying this is in connection with earlier correspondence, and we didn't mean to say what we said after all. In effect, that's what they said, and that there were certain things we couldn't do, but they in no way meant to say we couldn't pray or hold services or preach or anything like that. But some zealous person had said that to begin with, and I think that's really their philosophical position rather than their legal position, you understand. And so, all right, it would be a strange, and I never can say this word right, it would be a strange anomaly to hold that a state, having chartered a corporation to make use of certain franchises, could not, in the exercise of its sovereignty, inquire how those franchises had been employed and whether they had been abused, and demand the production of the corporate books and papers for that purpose. Now, all Hale versus Henkel shows me is language that the court has used to describe what a corporation is. I am sure that if I were a lawyer, or if lawyers for a church wanted, if we were being faced with Hale versus Henkel, lawyers for churches would quickly say, well, that had nothing to do with churches because of these reasons, and they would argue against it. But there isn't any question but what the U.S. Supreme Court has said several things. One, corporations are creatures of the state. Number two, having asked for existence by the state and being now its creation, what right do you have not to obey the laws of the state regarding corporations? Okay? So as corporate law grows and changes, any corporation becomes more or less, to a greater or lesser degree, accountable to the state for its actions before those laws. Now, it'd be real good right now, I think, to begin to draw a relationship between assumed powers of the state and the scriptural mandate that every soul is to be subject to higher powers. Because many fine men have argued that Romans 13 precludes any real activity on the part of churches, and that we really have to obey the state regardless. And who wants to be a lawbreaker? You know, any pastor in his right mind that thinks a suit is helpful to his church is smoking dope. Because being involved, having your name listed in a suit such as Calvary Baptist Church versus the U.S. of A., or the state of California versus Berean Baptist Church, having that happen is somewhat comparable to sticking yourself in the eye with a sharp stick, you know. And before you involve yourself in a lawsuit, you really ought to think about what it would be like to go over and poke a sleeping lion, you know, with a sharp hat pin or something, you know, because it gets, as my son says, it gets ugly quick. And so you really don't want it. You really, I can tell you from firsthand experience that this kind of thing hurts you far more than it helps you. And you need to be terribly certain you're right before you go violating state law and going against it. Now, Romans 13:1 says, "Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God." Now, when you get into Strong's dictionary and look at the word powers, he will tell you that that's delegated influence, authority, or jurisdiction. Delegated. Delegated by whom? By God. See, so the justified powers of the state are delegated to the state by God. And if I had the time, I'll just do this real quick. You have one power here, which is the state. You have another power over here, which is the church. Now, they are integral entities of their own. Now, I overlap them just a bit. Certain brethren in the country would separate them completely and say that the state never, ever, under any circumstance, had any authority over the church. And I think that's true in terms of ecclesiastical affairs and biblical affairs. Right. But I think we're probably crazy if we think we don't live in a real enough world to understand that we obligate ourselves to some extent for public safety. That's right. If you buy a bus and put it on the road, you have to license the bus, buy insurance for the bus, license the drivers. I know men who are involved deeply in this question who say you shouldn't even have to have a driver's license, you shouldn't even have to have a license on the bus. Well, I really think that's a little silly.
Yes, I do too.
I think it's carrying the question of jurisdiction a little too far. But I think that we want to remember that the powers of the state are delegated by God. Moreover, they're delegated by the people as well in our country. Right? Right. All the powers of government are delegated to government by the people. They're not appropriated by government as though it were something of its own. State is an entity of creation, by the way. You know? So it's clear that these powers have their authority delegated or ordained by God. Now, Jesus said in Matthew 22:21, you'll remember, on the question of taxes, he said on the coin, whose is this coin? Remember that question. He said, well, whose image is on it? Well, Caesar's. Well, then give to Caesar what is his. The word he used is render unto Caesar, the thing which is Caesar's, and render unto God the things that are God's. Now, the word render is the operative word. It means to give away, or to give up, to give over, or to give back. Now, think of it in that text. In that defining way. If I am to render to Caesar, I am to give to Caesar, give back to Caesar, give over to Caesar, give up to Caesar, only those things which are his. But I must retain, by Jesus' order, anything that belongs strictly to the church. Amen. Now, this relationship problem is so significant that Gary North said this: church does not need to beg the state for incorporation in order to exist as a perpetual legal entity. It is a limited liability organization. It has the right under God's law and under English common law as a trust institution. He makes the point that trusts register, whereas corporations apply. Now, relationship is what scares me. Remember that? So, I would not mind in the relationship between the church and the state to register. That is to say, we're out here. This church is here. We're functioning. But I don't feel like I could go and say, can we be here?
Yes.
You see the difference? Now, the legal minds that I've read really are telling me that the position of government now is that when you incorporate, you are saying, Mother, may I exist. Okay? Now, that's a burden. Now, this church that you're sitting in is an incorporated church. Our corporation was chartered in 1956. And we've lost some members because we were. If we undid it, we would lose some people over that, I'm sure. But let me talk for a few minutes. Let me go on with this quote. Until we recognize this fundamental organizational differences, that is, that trusts register and corporations apply, we will continue to place our churches under the sovereignty of the modern humanistic state. Remember, I didn't mention it a second time, but that Hale versus Hinkle said that the state was sovereign. Remember that? And asked the corporations to apply. 1979 in California, there was a pretty important finding by the Attorney General's office that tax exemption was not a right, they said, but was a bounty or a gratuity extended to the entity by a sovereign, which was the state. Now that smacks of a relationship that we couldn't really tolerate, and I really don't believe that that's the basis of English common law, and I really don't think it's the basis of U.S. law in the Constitution. Tax exemption for churches was recognized initially, as most of you know, because the lawmakers said, well, we can't tax God, that's his money. And therefore, you're exempt. I want to talk about those supposed benefits of incorporation for just a minute. Limited liability, we've said, this umbrella, which is supposed to protect the church. For years, we thought that would do that, but the truth is that practically speaking, government agencies have seldom hesitated to hold the officers liable for the actions of the corporation. I was involved in the early 1980s rather strongly in working with the state legislature to get some changes made. And I remember a meeting with some franchise tax board people. It was myself and the brother from ACSI, whose name is Paul Keenel, and some others. And we were meeting with men from the franchise tax board. And in that meeting, they told us they had just redrawn a particular form that we'd objected to, and they were sure we would now be very happy with it, and we wouldn't have any problems. And they'd fixed half of what we asked them to fix. And I told them, well, we sure appreciate that, but we still can't file it. And the man was livid with anger when I told him we still wouldn't file the forms. He wanted to know if I had any idea what it cost the state to change those kinds of forms, and I said, no, I don't. But we never told you that we only had one problem with it. We told you we had two problems. You've fixed one. We're glad. But the other problem is still there, and we still can't file them because of the other problem. Then he said to me, do you know that the Franchise Tax Board is the only state agency we know of that regularly gives data about the actions of local churches to the IRS? I said, I didn't know that. Doesn't surprise me, but I didn't know it. Does that have something to do with what we're talking about right now? He said, no, I just thought you would need to know that. And I said, well, you will have to do whatever you believe you have to do. And I always get along with people better if they just don't make threats. They just do whatever they, if you have to give our name to the IRS, then help yourself. If we've violated the law, you should do that. If we haven't, then everything's fine. So a couple of weeks later, I started getting notices from the IRS that they'd been looking at our our records, and we owed $20,000 in back FICA taxes. So in that wrestling match, they seized our bank accounts, and at the time we only had about $2,500 in them. And they, in subsequent meetings, they indicated they were going to exercise, that they wanted the names of our church officers. And I said, is there a statutory requirement for me to give you their names? No, it's voluntary. Well, then I wouldn't care to volunteer their names, because they were going to exercise what they called 100% penalty actions against the officers individually. So then what they would have done would have been file a lien on every officer's house for $20,000. See? So this limited liability, it's a pig in the poke. It doesn't mean anything. Every time I see a case where a law brief is prepared against the church, it says ABC Baptist Church, Pastor Whistle Switch, and John Doe's 1 through 50. In other words, the idea is to catch all of those corporate officers whom they do not know the name of yet. Interestingly, the agent who had seized our accounts asked for the names of the officers. He said, well, you don't have to give us their names, we've already got them. I said, oh, wonderful. And you're going to do 100% penalty actions? He said, yes. I said, well, then can I at least see your list so I can warn my men? And he said, sure. Handed me the list, and I read him and didn't recognize a name on the list. And I said, so I looked at the top. I looked first at the names. Then I looked at the top of the list, and it was the Calvary Baptist Church of Simi Valley. So I said, and on second thought, why don't you go ahead? Because those aren't the officers of our church anyway. Well, what do you mean? It's Calvary Baptist Church. I said, yes, of Simi Valley. It's a different corporation. Ours is Calvary Baptist Church of Fairfield. And the guy looked like he just had his face slapped. And his boss dropped her chin and said, was shaking her head. But I just had visions of those guys getting that penalty action against them and suing the fire out of them, for approaching them. It would have been a riot. But okay. Now the second benefit to corporations is tax exemption. Often churches have sought incorporation in order to enjoy the exemption from property and income taxes. What are our time restraints here?
You have about an hour.
Oh, amen. I don't need that much. And they couldn't tolerate that much anyway. Often churches have sought incorporation in order to enjoy exemption from property and income taxes. As a matter of fact, IRS regulation does not insist. Now listen, gentlemen. IRS regulation does not insist that the church be incorporated in order for the donors to deduct their taxes at the time they file their personal 1040. A church does not, listen to me, does not have to file a 1043 form with the IRS to be considered exempt. Now listen, federal government we're talking about, not state government. Not state government, federal government. Churches are presumed to be exempt by virtue of existence. Now, if you want to, and if you want an EIN, an employee identification number, or if you want a federal tax exemption number, then you can fill out a 1023 and get it. But you have to give away the store on the 1023 to get that recognition of something you're already presumed to have. Okay? Now, I'm positive of that as recently as a year ago, yes.
On this ID number, because in order to get like a bulk mailing stamp,
Yes, I know it.
There is also, you can also have if you have a brother in the congregation that's a CPA, you can also have him review your books and stamp it, and you can get a federal ID number off of his CPA stamp.
That's news to me. I didn't know that.
You do not have to fill out the 1023.
See, the 1023 is nasty, brethren. I mean, it's ugly. I'm going to show you and explain to you that the state twin brother to the 1023 is as bad. And it's required in the state. Yes, sir.
The situation you were talking about in the early 80s was the situation with the 199B, correct?
That's correct.
Can you take just a moment to explain what that was? Or is it?
It's more than a moment, but I'll try it. The 199B was a annual filing by church corporations with the state franchise tax board. If my memory serves me right, you had to give not how much money you'd received, but the sources of the income and the percentage of the sources. In other words, in a very broad sense. In other words, all you had to say on it was 100% of our income is from tithes or gifts. Okay, that's all. You didn't have to say Joe Blow gave us, Pete Smith gave us. Okay, then once you had done that, you had to, at the bottom of it, you had to check a box which said whether or not you'd had anything to do with influencing legislation that year. And if you had, presumably that would bring about a review, at least, of what you were doing. One pastor wrote and said, I regularly preach against certain things that come along. For instance, he said, a state proposition that involved not being able to hire homosexuals as school teachers. Our church worked against that. We worked hard. We sent letters. I preached on it. The abortion question, I preach on that. Is that political activity, and must I report that to the state? They wrote back and said, yes, it is, and yes, you must. So on that basis, we said, we can't fill this form out. We cannot put ourselves under that restraint. Okay? Now, we got a law passed which said that the law already said that you could file a statement or the IRS form or the Franchise Tax Board form, F199B. So we got a law passed in 84 which said that you could file a certified statement, a notarized statement that all of your gifts came from gifts. All of your money came from gifts. The purpose of the form was benign enough. The state simply wanted to know if you had unrelated business income. If you had a bread company and were making bread like the Catholics do, or wine like the Catholics do, they wanted to tax that portion of the income. And that's reasonable enough. So you could send them an affidavit, in other words, after this law passed, saying, yes, all of our income was from gifts. And then we could write on there a statement that said this information is given for the purpose of verifying that there was not unrelated business income and may not be used for any other reason. Right. And that's how we operated for several years. And then they just simply did away with the form. And now churches don't have to file it at all, which shows how important it was to begin with. But we were in a federal lawsuit up to our eyeballs in it, about to lose everything, because they said it was so important in the early 80s. Now, we were talking about IRS recognition of the church as being exempt, and they recognize you as exempt whether you've ever filed a 1023 or not. So John Labbins started the church. Okay? It's the Emmanuel Baptist Church of Whistle Switch, and he's never filed for 1023 recognition. He does not have to send an IRS form about his income, the church's income, to the IRS. His people can take everything they gave to the church off of their form if they itemize when they file at the end of the year, and everything's fine. I do not know, and there may be one, but I'm not aware of a case where a church has been challenged over whether or not it filed a 1023 as to be, whether it was exempt or not. Now, some churches that the IRS suspected were shams have been sent forms to be filled out. One of those is in the package you'll get, the various kinds of questions they ask to see if they were, if they've matched up. For instance, what is the legal form of the organization? Attach copies of the organization's creating instruments. Furnish descriptive and detailed financial statements for the current year and the prior. This should include the organization's source of financial support. Give a narrative description of the activities carried on by the organization. Include a complete description of the characteristics that qualify the organization as a church. Tell us why you're a church. This would come into play if they thought you weren't, and they were having to try to prove you weren't. And by the way, that's the posture we ought to always be in. The burden of proof ought always to be on government to prove that the church is not a church, rather than on the church to prove that it is. You see. So if they were questioning your status as a church, you might get this Form 8123 sent to you, and you'd have to fill out it. Much of the information in it is what they would normally get in the 1023. Okay? So you might sometimes be questioned as to your status, and you might be asked to fill this out, and you'd have to decide whether you wanted to or not at that point. Of course, we've already discussed the Bob Jones University case. The court found that the school's beliefs were onerous, so they set aside their tax-exempt status. So tax exemption is not guaranteed to a church. I think it is innate in the Constitution. I think that as a preacher, most lawyers would say, we don't know whether it is or not, but I believe it was. And the tax exemption you get may or may not stand up in court anyway. So when the IRS seized our bank accounts in 81, we filed an action against the U.S. government to try to restrain the government from further seizures against our accounts. Went into U.S. District Court in Sacramento, and the judge, the local lawyers in Sacramento that were going to help us backed out on the morning we were to go to trial. They called me and wouldn't represent me. They did agree to send somebody there in case that they wouldn't let me represent the church. So that's cute, isn't it? Me going in as a lawyer to represent the church. But my wife and I went up by ourselves that morning and took our documents and filed them, and then went before the judge. And when the lawyers had backed out, so it was the U.S. district, it was the lawyer for the U.S. government and me. And it was Calvary Baptist Church versus U.S. of A. That's a scary thought in a federal court. I was really overwhelmed by that. So as the judge called the case, and we came, he said, Pastor, he said, I don't think you can represent the church. You're not a lawyer, and the church is a corporation, so you can't represent the church. Now, if the church had not been a corporation, I could have represented the church. But because it was a corporation, laws kept me from doing it, see. So I said to the judge, well, what do we do? We're here. Can I please just tell you my story? And he said, yes, that'll be fine. And so I told him what had happened, and he was shaking his head, and his comment was that once government starts, they can't stop, it seems like. And he meant that once they put this thing in action, they just lurched right ahead and did the seizure. The problem that day was that about 3 days before we went to court, the Amish case that was Lee versus U.S. came up over Social Security taxes, which was our question. And that was an Amish man in Pennsylvania. All of his employees, he was a farmer, but he had a cabinet making company, and his employees were all Amish. None of them wanted to be in the civil. My tongue. None of them were in the Social Security system, nor did they want to be. And but the government was saying he had to collect it and pay it. So for 1 quarter he collected it and paid it, and then didn't collect any more and went to tax court. That went all the way to the top of the Supreme Court cases. And Berger wrote the opinion, and in it he said that though there was no question that these men's religious beliefs were being violated, again, the compelling interest to the state in keeping the Social Security system viable meant that they would have to be in it anyway. So that had just come out. So here was a case that said a religious conviction against the payment of Social Security taxes could not prevail. And here I am in court on that very question in behalf of the church. So he denied our petition and let the levy go forward. And then in private conversation, the federal government agreed to drop their suit if we would drop our suit. And then they didn't try to take any more of our money, and later admitted they were wrong and had to pay us the money back with interest. This question of tax exemption is a tough question, and I think it's a right, but I think it's something we're going to have more and more trouble keeping. Yes, sir.
In the Amish situation, is that still in effect?
Oh, yeah.
Social Security?
Well, now, understand this was a private employer who happened to be Amish. It wasn't the congregation or the church. It was a private employer, and they as individuals just simply didn't want to be in the system. They were just a commercial business enterprise, but their own personal religious faith dictated that they would not be in the system. They said they would never accept Social Security payments to them in their old age. They would never do that, even if they were forced to pay into it. And I think many of those people wouldn't. They probably would never collect it. But they're being taxed anyway.
Can you explain that some organizations, school districts and so forth, do not have to pay into that?
Okay. The nonprofit corporations were not in the Social Security system until 1984. Prior to 1984, any nonprofit corporation did not have to be in the Social Security system. When the Social Security system was started in the 1930s, churches were specifically excluded and prohibited from participating. Well, in the 40s and 50s, many churches hollered and said, "This isn't fair. Our employees ought to be included as well. Please give us a way to put our employees in." So Congress said, "All right, you'll have to waive your exemption. Here is a detailed form, and you're going to have to say, we no longer accept this exemption. We don't want it. Please let us in the system." So that went on for a while. Then these same churches said, "Gee, this is really hard. We have to do this heavy form every year. Please, can't you make it easier for us to get in?" So in 1964, led by a voice vote in the Senate and passed by the head of the it was earlier than 64, 62. I think it was Lyndon Johnson who gavelled it to close. They created what they called a constructive waiver. And a church could collect and pay Social Security taxes on its employees for 3 quarters in a row, and they were in. That's all they had to do. So what the IRS had done with us was discover that we had inadvertently collected and paid, I think, a gross total of $40 on a secretary in 1965, and therefore we were in now whether we wanted to be or not. What was initially said to be a benevolent ruling, "We'll let you in if you want," was now construed to be, "You pay 3 quarters, you're in, buddy, whether you want to be in or not." It was all voluntary, Harvey, until 1984. In 1980, when President Reagan took office, he promised he'd fix the Social Security system and make it viable. What was in the beginning a system where you had one contributor, or rather you had about 500 contributors for every recipient. By 1980, we were down to about 50 contributors for one recipient. And by the year 2000, we'll be at about 2 recipients for every one contributor. And so that system is going to break ultimately again. But one of the fixes that Mr. Reagan put into effect was the Congress put all of the nonprofits in. Hospitals, cemetery associations, all the nonprofit corporations, you're in now. They didn't put Congress in.
Of course not.
And they didn't put federal employees in. But all the nonprofits were put in, including churches. So under that ruling, churches would have been required to pay the employer's portion of Social Security taxes. So for the first time, 200 years of history, there was a mandated direct tax on the income of the church. First time ever. It wasn't couldn't be construed. It wasn't a tax on the employee, it was a tax on the employer, and in this case, the church. Churches yelled and hollered. I made 2 trips to Washington, D.C., and we made enough noise that the Republican Senate at that time, Mr. Dole was chairman of the Finance Committee, agreed to set up a particular set of procedures where churches could get out of the Social Security system by filing a particular document which wasn't hard to file, but you had to do it within a 60-day period. There was a window of time, and you had to jump through the hoop in that window of time, or you were in the system irrevocably. The law of the Medes of the Persians altereth not. And so some churches are out today, Harvey, because they jumped out that hoop in '84. Others are in because they either didn't know to jump out or decided not to jump out or whatever. Yes?
Isn't it pretty consistently true that whenever they open these little windows for special things like that, they have a habit not to let anybody know? Exactly.
That happens. This was widely known because we were on top of it at the time. But yes, that is pretty consistent. Hearings will be held at a specific time, but you don't know about it. Now, they're publicly, you have to be reading public notices to find it. They're usually they cover their ground by legally doing it, but it's hard to find. It's in the back page of some legal publication. You don't see it. Yes?
Your church jumped out?
Yes, we did. Now, the employees, the school teachers are considered self-employed. Now, for us to maintain our freedom, not having to pay taxes, our poor teachers are paying now 15.5% or something like that. Whereas if it had remained the other way, the church would be paying 6 or 7%, and they'd be paying 8 or 9%, something like that. I don't know what the percentages are, but it would be a shared thing rather than that. Now, the argument is put forward, let me hurry forward here, to that another benefit of incorporation is to hold property or to open bank accounts. I know that the church I started in Northbrook, Illinois, opened bank accounts and bought property before we ever incorporated. And I was naive, and we just went to the bank, and the bank said to open our bank accounts, they said, give us your ID number. I don't have an ID number. Well, do you have a Social Security number? Yes, and I gave them that. They may have closed that opportunity. They may not allow that anymore. But that's how we did it then. I don't know they do that now. Yes.
They will do that now. When I went to the bank there in Hampton, and I didn't know any of this.
I think the bank, it's up to the bank.
May, but no other banks around here will.
Yeah. Well, the bank I went to said you have to have a number or your Social Security number.
Yeah.
And I didn't feel at ease to put my Social Security number, but I didn't want to call it IRS either.
Yeah.
They said, well, what are you? I said, well, right now we're a mission of this church. So we'll use that number. So I talked to my pastor, he said, fine.
Okay.
So,
Yeah. Now,
This is the form you have to fill out in all the churches. It's an SS4.
it's in their material.
Okay.
I photocopied it in the
Okay.
material. And it's not that frightening. It just asks you what you do. There's nothing, I read over it, and I didn't find anything in there that would make me not want to fill it out. But you sure create a relationship.
This is Social Security, not IRS.
Right. This gives you an identification number for Social Security. Now,
For new churches being started under the auspices of Baptist Bible Fellowship Missions, they allow new churches to use the Baptist Bible Fellowship Incorporation name.
I know they do. And if you're comfortable with that, that's fine. It just depends on whether you want to be a part of truly be a part of a denomination when you do that. I mean, you're saying that's our mother organization. And I don't know whether independent Baptists want to do that either. See, we're so cranky, you know. But
it gets you started.
if you can do that, help yourself. You know.
If you want to bail out next year, fine.
When you get in a boat, you're in it for the duration. And you may be in rapids before you know it. And getting out, when it was easy to get in nice calm water under a tree on the riverbank, may be raging rapids in a canyon 5 minutes later. So be careful that you can live with the relationship before you start. I'm not rebuking you or scolding you. I'm just saying one of our problems as fundamental Baptists is we're so pragmatic. I mean, we'll do the practical, easy thing. Man, if it works, do it. That's a worldly philosophy. Things work that you shouldn't do. You know? And we practice situational ethics in our church building. Something, if it works to parachute a guy out of heaven onto your church grounds, we do it, you know? I know a man in California that got rich selling churches in California automated typewriters in the late 60s and early 70s that were rejects that nobody could repair anymore. And he sold them for $5,000 a machine. This church had one when I got here. You had to have it, it sounded like, it was an you had to feed it raw meat to get it to work. You know, IBM already had, it was before the floppy disk computer age, and IBM already had a card typewriter that would do the same thing and make hardly any noise at all. This sounded like a boiler room in a battleship, you know. But he sold them by the carload to preachers because they decided everybody else is doing it, let's do it. So be careful before you do something because it's expedient. Or because somebody taught you a lesson in a seminar, amen? Be a thinker, for heaven's sake, and think something through and find out. It sounds like I'm scolding you. I just took your comment as a springboard to holler a little bit. So,
As I said earlier this week, I have skin like a rhinoceros. Go right ahead.
we have to, amen? We have to. Now, so this church is an incorporation. I don't like the relationship. I'd like to undo the relationship. So I could go unincorporate. Now, in private conversations with David Gibbs, I learned that's a rather treacherous road. Here are some of the problems that happen when you disincorporate. Number one, there's the problem of agency. There's some idea in legal doctrine that every member of the organization now becomes an agent for the whole. So that this guy over here in the pew says, I think our church needs a new organ. So he goes to the Allen Organ Company and buys a $25,000 organ and signs it for Calvary Baptist Church. Now we all have to pay. And it might be a legal binding document if you don't have officers and corporate resolutions to buy. Maybe that could be a problem. Then there's the problem of contract debts. If you've entered into a mortgage, as our church has, on the basis of a corporate resolution to do so, and you unincorporate, the bank's security is really violated. Mr. Gibbs told me of a church in Ohio. The pastor went to a seminar like this. Some nut got up and talked about incorporation. And he went home and said, bless God, I'm not going to be incorporated anymore. And he burned the papers and filed dissolution papers and was unincorporated in a matter of a week or two. Boy, I'm free. And the bank called and said, say, about that note, that $600,000 you owe us at 4% interest, we know you're going to pay, but now you're not a corporation, so we'd like you to execute new papers. We won't charge any more, same $600,000, but let's do it at 12% now instead of 4%. Okay? And the pastor choked and said, oh my goodness, you know. So, what?
And he was stuck.
And he's stuck. He's stuck. So, you know, you can really be in trouble. Yeah. Before, there's two other problems. One is the increased risk to the officers in terms of personal liability. That may, in fact, exist if you unincorporate. And you may have dramatic insurance problems if you're not incorporated. So you better check all of that out before you jump into some other form. Now, let me... Go ahead.
I was going to ask you, on the choice, you say you would rather be unincorporated?
Okay. Let me answer the question and then give you what I think may be something of a solution. I would rather be in the posture of not being incorporated because I've just begun, by now I've had enough government people tell me, hey, you're incorporated, aren't you? Well, why are you complaining about having to obey rules now that you're incorporated? And Hale versus Hinkle is laying there, even though it's almost 100 years old now. And I think the doctrine is pretty well established in law that corporations are creatures of the state. I got on the phone yesterday with an attorney friend of mine. He is not connected with Gibbs and Craze. He's a private lawyer who represents an insurance company. And I asked him to talk to me for a few minutes about what kind of a mechanism you could have where you weren't asking the state for the right to exist. I said, talk to me about a trust. Tell me what a trust does. And he said, well, in a trust, the posture is different. You're not asking the church, or not asking the state to recognize the body. You're notifying the state that this trust has been created. Now, in a trust, assets are put in the hands of a trustee, in trust for the body. Now, that trust could be irrevocable. In other words, it's in perpetuity forever, or it could be structured with limitations. So some churches, in fact, the state of Virginia requires churches to be trusts and will not allow them to be corporations, according to Mr. Gary North. Because they say, churches shouldn't be corporations. That's something else. You don't want to be a corporation. That's interesting when Virginia was so much the seat of religious liberty anyway. But so it is conceivable that you could form your church under the Scriptures. And then you could file trust documents with the state. And all the assets of the trust would be placed in trust in the hands of a trustee. Now that could be, theologically, that would need to be, I suppose, the pastor. Now careful, that sounds onerous, doesn't it? Okay, so the documents could be structured so that the trustor instructs the trustee to manage the assets in a very specific way. He couldn't sell the property even though he's the trustee. He can't sell the property unless the trustor has said he can. So you could require the same voting requirements as in any others. You could structure it exactly as we do now, limiting the authority of the pastor but making him the trustee. Now some churches up in Oregon have done that, and in other places in the country, and it apparently is working. I believe that if I went somewhere and started the church in California today, I would probably do it that way, and fix it so that the trustee changed whenever the pastor of the church changed. You'd have to structure that extremely carefully because the trustee has powers that are very, very wide and comprehensive powers under trusts. So the church would want to be... What?
Multiple trustees?
I think you can have multiple trustees. I suppose you'd have to examine that on the basis of your theology and whether you wanted to set it up that way. I'm talking to you about something that I've only really picked up in the last few days when I talk about trusts. So I'm not recommending it to you. I'm telling you I think that's what I might do, yes.
Do you know if the trust situation would meet the requirements that, say, a bank would have in the purchase of property? Because this is one of the things that Brother Johnson and some of the rest of the new churches
I think it would. I believe it would.
So that would solve
But
that.
I'm saying that out of conjecture because I honestly, all I did was ask him, can a trust hold property? And he said yes. So can they dispose of it? The trustee does that for the trust. Yes.
It does create problems. We've had experience with, as a trust going to a bank trying to get loans and things. A lot of banks don't want to deal with trusts. It does create litigation or an analysis. They have to analyze the trust in a different way than they would another entity. And some banks just don't want to do that.
I'm sure that's true, Derek.
Are you a trust, Derek?
We have things in trust, yes, and it's
Is your church incorporated?
Well, no, our church is not. I say personally, we have had a lot of experience with trust.
Okay.
And some banks just don't want to touch it.
Yeah. But some banks don't want to loan to churches either.
Right.
Would the CLA possibly know anything about?
CLA's recommendation has been that you incorporate. That's their most recent thing. See, I think they would probably disagree with some of the things I'm telling you. I need to be careful. I'm not a lawyer. Dave Gibbs and his partners are far more knowledgeable in this than I am. I'm telling you as a pastor and as a believer in the verses of Scripture that I gave you, that I have trouble rendering to Caesar the things Caesar is demanding of corporations. That's what I'm saying. Again, it's the relationship that troubles me more than the other. Now, yes.
I just heard David Gibbs' words about 6 months ago on this particular issue, and he said right now he views the balance with the problems of not having incorporation versus incorporation such that they're still recommending incorporation. He says,
Right.
I've got my eyes on it, and when I think the balance swings, I'm going to quick tell everybody. And
Meanwhile, though, we're already entangled.
Hey, listen, I'm a preacher. I'm a pastor. I'm not a lawyer. I think we're in trouble. Let me finish. When pastors ask lawyers what to believe. Now, I think we should go to lawyers and say, this is what I believe. Now, what's my legal question?
Yes. Yes.
Okay? Now, I think a man is also rather foolish if he throws away legal counsel based on, well, I know better because I'm a preacher. Okay? But I'm afraid, and I say this with a great deal of hesitance, but I'm afraid that in the last 20 years or so we've said, hey, CLA, or hey, Christian Legal Defense, or hey, what should I do? Rather than having our religious faith. See, we shouldn't be in conflict with the law unless our faith is involved. Okay? It's wrong of me or you or anybody to be in conflict with the state over their laws unless there's a faith question. Yes.
Barry, we saw a lot of that, you remember, during the time of the litigation.
Yes.
And a lot of the men came and said, basically, you tell us what. And I remember the Mount Hermon situation where they put on the mock trial.
Yes.
And I'll tell you what, that scared the fire out of me.
You bet.
I went back and said, I better know what I believe.
Absolutely.
And that made a difference.
So on that basis, I want to get to this, brother, but on that basis, I am telling you that I believe my faith, my personal faith, would preclude becoming a corporation. I think I might be able to live with the trust. I need to get over here to one other thing and quit. It's pretty quick, but we got to talk about the way in which churches become tax exempt in California, because you have to have that understanding of that too, or this session won't mean much.
Okay, one of the clients I work for, he deals strictly in trust. This is the private sector. And I've talked to him a little bit about this. One of the nice things is you can have your sending church as the trustor, so that as he sends out the church, he can basically set it up so that during this time the church goes out as a unit to establish itself, he sets up rules and regulations for that church and holds the money and the assets. I know that goes against...
Yeah, it goes against my faith. Yeah.
But no, there's some advantages to that, as long as disadvantages.
Okay. I'm just going to say, okay. But let me say to you, again, what I said to this brother, and that is something which is expedient may not be the answer. You know, and the advantage may be there. There's an advantage to winning the lottery. You know? Yeah. Forgive me, but one of my pet peeves in this whole question of church-state affairs is we're looking for easy ways around tough problems. And I've given lectures, a dozen lectures on incorporation in the last 10 years, and I've never had an answer. I just don't like incorporations, but I don't know what to do about it. I wonder if the trust is the answer. Now, come to the question of tax exemption in California. I told you that you didn't have to file anything to become tax exempt federally. Now I'm going to tell you that in order for a trust or a corporation to become tax exempt in California, you have to file Form 3500, FTB 3500. Now, for years, I've believed that that form constituted an unacceptable intrusion into the life of a church. Information which must be divulged is pervasive and comprehensive. Providing the information presumes a subordination to the government, which in my opinion is forbidden by Scripture. When I got ready to prepare this presentation to you today, I said, okay, Harry, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to fill out a 3500 form. I'll just do it and use it as an example. I got 6 questions into it, and I said, why am I doing this? I wouldn't do this. If I were starting a new church, I wouldn't give this information to the state. Why am I doing it as an exercise in futility right now? So I just used a couple of keystrokes on my computer and deleted about 3 pages of information and closed the notes. But now let me tell you why. Let me tell you why. When you're filling out the 3500, they after they get your name, address, zip code, phone number, and you're a church, and you're incorporated, and when you were organized, and when you were incorporated, and your California corporation number. Okay, they find out if you've ever asked for exemption before, then they start asking questions. Here's the first one that I had problems with. Is this a membership organization? Yes. Okay. If yes, attach a statement which fully explains the qualifications for members, the different classes of membership, the number of members in each class, and the voting rights and privileges accorded to each class. Okay, I can do that. Come down a few more questions. Will any promoter, incorporator, founder, or member be employed by the organization? Yeah, yes. Okay, furnish complete details including duties, responsibilities, qualifications, and compensation. Now, okay, our pastor's going to be paid $65,000 a year. Is there an opening? Can I submit my resume, right? Okay. That number comes in. Some bureaucratic mouse in an office somewhere, some bean counter says 65,000 for a preacher. Well, all he does is preach one sermon on Sunday morning, and it isn't ever very good. 65,000 for that? Or he says, that's not too bad. That's all right. I'll go to the next question. I've just illustrated something, and I don't know whether you caught it.
Right.
He got to decide.
Yes. Yeah.
See, that agent, that bureaucrat said, I mean, if you're giving this information, somebody has to say, okay.
Yeah.
Or, whoops, and mail you a note. Right? Am I wrong?
Right.
Exactly.
So you're giving the information, presumably, unless it's an exercise in real stupidity, which it may be, and may have no practical function at all, and no bureaucrat may ever look at it. But it's on the form.
Yeah.
And it presumes a subordination.
Right.
All right. To ensure that the Franchise Tax Board will process your exemption application, attach the following information to your application. If the organization is incorporated, a copy of the endorsed articles of incorporation and all subsequent amendments. If it is now being incorporated, submit proposed articles to the Secretary of State with the application. If it is not incorporated, trust, a copy of the Constitution, Articles of Association, Declaration of Trust, or other documents setting forth the aims and purposes of the organization signed by the principal officers. Send a copy of the bylaws. Complete statements of receipts and expenditures, assets and liabilities for each accounting period that the organization was in existence, and for which exemption is requested. A proposed budget showing the sources of income and the areas of expenditure for the first year of operation of a newly formed organization or one commencing operations. The budget is required before the FTB will process the application and should be based upon the most reasonable expectations. A statement describing the specific purposes for which the organization was formed. Do not quote the articles of incorporation or bylaws for this purpose. A statement describing in detail the programs and activities that the organization presently conducts or will conduct and how it will accomplish its specific purposes. All of those are going to have to be reviewed by some bureaucrat who decides whether they're appropriate or not. Right, yes.
The pastor who started the church that I'm now pastoring submitted one of those. When I took the church over, there was a letter from the state saying that before they could process it any further, we would have to change our bylaws to say that we would not engage in any propaganda or political activity.
So you had to say you wouldn't before they would do that.
And I called somebody at the state. I wish I would have written their name down and talked to them. I said, what is propaganda and political activity? They said, well, you know, passing bills and abortion and homosexuality. I specifically asked about abortion and homosexuality, and they said, yes, that was political activity. I said, thank you, and the thing's still sitting. I never touched it.
Do you still have the documents?
Yes, sir.
Would you send me, as a courtesy, a photocopy of their letter, and if you have it, a copy of the statement that was submitted? See, that proves what I'm. Well, okay.
I got a copy of their letter saying
that's fine. That helps me in my. See, I told you that it presumes someone's going to sit in judgment on whatever you turn in. Okay. Interestingly,
before they will process that, it's got to be changed. So we can't. What? Go ahead.
Yeah.
Do I need this, preacher? Do I need this?
What do you mean?
Do I need this
exemption? I don't think so. But let me finish the bad stuff, because it's fun doing the bad stuff.
Come on.
And yeah, don't cut off my water now. I spent too many hours getting ready. There's one in here that always slays me. Let me get it here. Okay, here it is. A statement that fully explains any discontinued specific activities that the organization has engaged or is sponsored, but isn't doing anymore. Give the dates of commencement and termination and the reasons for discontinuance. Copies of leases. Samples of literature that the organization sells or distributes. Samples of any organizational advertising. Then further down here it says, is the organization now, has it ever been, or does it plan to be engaged in carrying on propaganda, otherwise advocating or opposing pending or proposed legislation? So you're going to say yes, if you fill it out. And you're honest. You're going to say yes. I've had Baptist brethren say, well, I'm just going to say no. It's not honest.
That's right.
It's not honest. And so presumably they're going to say, to what extent are you going to do that? Or in this case, you have to say you're not going to do that. Now, I was testifying before a state Senate committee on the question of this whole subject. And the senator who used to be a senator, whose name is Mars Garcia, said to me, he said, well, you're a corporation, aren't you? Yes. He said, then what do you, and you're a religious corporation? Yes. He said, well, then you shouldn't be involved in politics. You shouldn't be even up here. And he said, you don't have a right to come to try to get us to change laws. You're precluded from that. I said, now just a minute, Mr. Garcia. I said, 100 years ago, was abortion a legislative question, or was it a moral question handled by churches? He said, well, 100 years ago it was a moral question. I said, okay. And immorality and homosexuality, was that a legislative question or a church faith question 100 years ago? He said it was a church faith question. I said, then who got in whose business?
Amen.
And I knew I didn't have his vote anyway. So you might as well do that. See? Now, this is a legislator who introduced a bill to save the life of a dog. A woman died in San Mateo County, and she had in her will that she wanted her little dog Sido, S-I-D-O, euthanized upon her death. The Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals filed suit to stay the execution of the little doggy. The state legislature, that same legislator introduced a bill to save the life of the dog. They brought the dog to Sacramento and had it appear in a Senate hearing to give testimony. Now, you're laughing, but we're talking about insanity. This is a legislator who believes dogs should live, but babies should die. And when I asked him in the hallway about that one day, I said, why is it that you believe that dogs should live and babies should die? I thought I was going to be thrown out on my ear. He was irate. He's no longer a state senator. He was a Republican. Said he was a Republican. I don't know what he really is. But this is ridiculous. You see? The last time the homosexual bill came up, or the next to the last time, I went to a hearing. Accidentally, I was there on other matters and went in to see how this one thing was going. And the man who was handling the Christian side of it didn't want me to testify. And I didn't intend to testify. But the thing was out of hand. There must have been 200 homosexuals there. And the chairman of the committee let them go on for 2 hours in their testimony about how their rights were being violated. And then he limited the churches to 10 minutes. And when it was all over, nobody quoted any verses. Nobody had given God's side of the question. And I thought they're going to close this thing and vote, and God's side's never going to be heard. That's the voice of the prophet, is to let God's side be known in the controversy. And that's my job, to take God's side in the controversy. I really believe that. So they were about to close, and the man whose bill it was the man who's just unelected as mayor of San Francisco. What's his Agnos? But now, in deference to Mr. Agnos, he says, I always found him to be a gentleman. And I walked down the aisle. They were ready to close the hearing, and the chairman had said, "Is there any other comment?" And he didn't want any more. That's the way they close. And so I said to Mr. Agnos, I said, "Are you closing the hearing, or can I make one more statement?" He said, "No, sir. You can make one more statement." He said, "That's what these hearings are for." So I said, my name is Harry Jackson. I'm here. I don't represent anybody. I'm here by myself. I'm simply here as a man of God. And I just want all you on the committee to understand that you've already made up your minds, you're already going to vote, and you're going to pass this legislation and send it on to the Senate. But you need to know that what you're about to approve was forbidden by God. And God has promised judgment on those who go against His word. Now, this had been a circus, gentlemen. This is one of the most precious moments of my whole life, because the thing had, and it's not to my credit, please understand that, the place was a circus. The chairman said at one point, he said, "If we'll hurry up and get out of here, maybe I can go home and practice some heterosexuality." The chairman of the committee said that. And the place, it was a circus. They were laughing at the Christians and guffawing. And as I started to talk, the room got real quiet. And I said, I think that you who are about to vote need to understand that you're legislatingly approving that which God calls an abomination. And if you do that, you're going to invite the wrath of God on yourself. And you really ought to think before you do that. And it was as quiet as it is here. And And afterwards, two of the legislators thanked me. And they said, I was going to vote against it, but you made it easier for me.
Amen.
See, now I couldn't, you see, you sign this thing and say you're not going to do that. You can't ever do that. I don't know that God would call every preacher to do that, or that you'd have opportunity to do that. But if you did and he told you to, you'd have to, see? Okay, so that's right. You can't preach it in your pulpit. I've had them say, we don't care what you do in your church with only your members there. But when you invite the public in, then we have a right to tell you what you can and can't do. I don't believe that. Amen. Not for a minute. Okay, now, here's what I think I would do. I'll answer your question. What are we to do? I think that I would start a church, form a trust, and assume that we were tax exempt. I would never file this form. I would just assume that we were tax exempt. Now, they'd have to question that at some point if they decided they wanted to, and then I'd have to just respond to whatever their questions were at that time, or not respond, or do whatever was necessary. It might be, the penalty would be that you wouldn't have exemption from property taxes if they finally, the property tax question is not included. I'm talking about before the Franchise Tax Board. And as I'm talking to you, I'm realizing that property taxes are going to be a problem in that posture. If you haven't filed and been found exempt, then the property taxes are going to be a problem. So I think that's what I would do. And I know I create more problems than answers in this thing because Brother Stonestreet and I talked a while ago. He got up against this. He couldn't buy property. He couldn't build. So he went ahead and incorporated, and he went ahead and filled this out. Now, I don't know what he said about that propaganda thing, and he doesn't remember what he said either. I know Brother Stonestreet well enough to know he'd never give away his right. See, I know that about him.
Probably the property taxes would not be affected because they're collected by the counties.
Yes, but when you first file for exemption at the county level, I've got to go back and look at the documents, but I think you have to say you're organized under Section 23701D of the R&T Code, which is this section we're talking about right here. And if you'd never filed for this, I'm not sure you could say that.
Brother Johnson says that he filled that out, said yes, has not heard back from them.
Okay. How long did it take you to do the documentation?
A lot of prayer.
Yeah.
Hours.
I don't know whether I could, I've already told you I don't believe I could do it. That doesn't mean I fault you for having done it. I'm not starting a church. I'm sitting here in the comfort of an already established church. I don't have to worry about it. I can be as theoretical as I want to be,
Is the IRS one? It sounds like it's the same
This
word.
is the IRS. See, the state of California has a mad desire to conform to the federal government in every way and to make it stronger. And I went to hearings about 7-8 years ago and tried to get them to throw this out and to follow IRS guidelines about churches. And they say, well, ours are a little tougher. We like them better.
But it's very similar to the...
Yeah, I'm sure this is the 1023 adapted at the state level, probably. Yes.
Harry, when we're talking tax exemption, we're talking about the state saying people can give to your organization and take off of their income tax. That's what you're talking. You're not
That's
talking
right.
sales tax. You're not talking anything.
No. And I'm also saying that the income of the church is not subject to tax. Okay? Now, the downside, if they challenged you after you'd assumed it and hadn't filed for it, would be they would say, okay, Mr. and Mrs. Smith can't take it off their state taxes anymore, and now you have to start paying income tax and filing income tax forms as a church. I think they would, as a trust. You'd have to do whatever a trust had to do in terms of income.
Let me say this, and I don't mean to get into Brother Jackson's
No, I'm
material,
at the end of my material.
but I do feel that we need to begin to teach our people that they should tithe, whether it's deductible off their income tax or not. It's a biblical mandate, not a benefit. And that's something that we should begin to teach regularly, because the day may come, and so what? Yes, sir.
There's a new curve that the state legislature has thrown at us that has taken effect on January 1st of 1992. For any church that has a post-secondary school, past high school, used to be 94303B of the California Education Code says any church can operate a post-secondary school as long as they're just teaching the tenets of their faith. They are exempt from all of the Education Act requirements. Now the Education Act has been amended to turn around and say only nonprofit corporations in the state of California can offer post-secondary certificates, diplomas, or degrees. So in other words, if you're a non-incorporated church and you want to have a Bible school,
You can't give degrees. If you gave a degree, you'd be violating state law.
You can't give a diploma. You can't give a certificate of completion.
Yeah.
So, and it came out of the.
Was that case down there, yeah.
in Santee. So now they're saying in effect that only churches that are incorporated can have Bible institutes.
Yeah. Brother Wilson?
Brother Jackson, there's an appendage to the Bob Jones situation. Of course, it's a school, not a church. Several years ago, I heard Dr. Bob III make the statement that's the best thing that ever happened to us. Because they bought property and now they can operate as a corporation and collect revenue.
Yeah. And they've saved multiplied millions of dollars because they quickly had to really sharpen their pencils to make sure they weren't liable for more taxes. And that caused them to get serious about saving money. I've heard some of the ways they save.